Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Meantime, bad news on the inflation front. The Federal Reserve's favorite measure of inflation, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, is up in new January data. This was released on Friday. And just to give a sense of some of the numbers and the context, the monthly increase in the PCE was 0.6%. That is the highest since last June. In December, it was 0.2, November 0.2, October 0.4, September 0.3. So that is a pretty big increase. And that feeds into these year-over-year averages, which is what you generally see quoted in the headlines or the tops of the media stories. So the Journal's report today says that the PCE is up 5.4% in January year-over-year, up from 5.3 in December. And Monet, you're a close watcher of this economic data. How do you read this report today on the inflation and the problem that it creates now for the Federal Reserve?
Well, the PCE numbers were really disappointing for anyone who believed or hoped that inflation really had been brought under control by the Fed's previous interest rate increases. It's interesting that people tend to focus more on CPI, in part because those numbers come out earlier, but PCE has been telling a slightly different story than CPI all along, basically since inflation started to increase. And in that, PCE didn't show inflation climbing quite as high as CPI did over the summer surge, but it also hasn't shown it declining quite as much. And you mentioned that it's the Fed's favorite indicator. Part of the reason for that is that it captures the difference in goods that people consume as the relative prices of different goods and services changes. And it also captures a slightly broader scope of transactions. It captures some business transactions, including out-of-pocket purchases. And so Jerome Powell and the rest of the Fed board members believe that it's a more accurate snapshot of the direction of the economy. And so the fact that there was this increase in the 12-year index from December to January is another confirmation to the skeptics that the interest rate increases we've had so far haven't managed to cool inflation as much as a lot of people had hoped. And it definitely is a sign to the markets that it's very likely that the Fed is going to continue increasing rates to a higher terminal rate probably than a lot of people expected, and perhaps even bigger incremental increases in coming months than a lot of people expected.
And it does seem like this increase in the data today may reset some of the expectations and the political debate around inflation, because there had been some recent good numbers. I think President Biden was saying, I think he was hoping that the worst was behind him. And to be fair, maybe the worst was behind him. I think we're probably past the peak. And yet here's the reaction this morning from Jason Furman, former economic advisor to President Obama. He says on Twitter, "The economy is very overheated. We have made little, if any, progress on inflation. There's little, if any, reason to expect a large slowdown going forward." And then he computes the core PCE rate at an annual rate over different periods, but 7.1% over the month, 4.7 over 3 months. And remember, the Fed's target is 2% inflation, Kate. And so it suggests that there is a lot of work yet to be done. And this inflation beast that the United States has been wrestling with, that the president has been wrestling with, that consumers, people going to the grocery store every day and trying to fill up their gas tank, this inflation beast is unfortunately not slain yet.
Well, Kyle, I, for one, am surprised because the Inflation Reduction Act was supposed to manage this. It's right in the name. I'm being slightly glib there, but I do think it's worth noting that the Biden administration's political response out of Congress and working with Congress, there wasn't anything there that was really going to manage the inflation problem. Quite the opposite. They threw a bunch of money at green climate subsidies. They did price controls on prescription drugs. The spending blowout that the Biden administration has presided over has contributed to inflation, but you don't see any type of pivot or changing tax. I mean, if you go back to the president's State of the Union address and try to look for a new idea, you'll come up empty. I mean, he's talking about increasing taxes, talking about blowing out the child tax credit, which I think contributed to the original inflation problem. I mean, Jason Furman, who you just quoted, I think takes a slightly different view. But if you give families tremendous amounts of cash like that, I think you can expect it to be inflationary. But anyway, it has just been the same type of political response from the Biden administration, which is basically to try to use their legislative agenda to throw a bunch of money out the door and financed by debt. So I don't think the inflation problem has been solved, to your point. I think there's pain left to go, but hopefully that enduring reality might inspire some change in the policies, the fiscal and legislative policies that the Biden administration is pursuing to try to manage it.
But I agree with Kate that the Biden administration does not seem interested in changing its tack here at all. If it was interested, there would be policies that it could go after, and some of them would be small or one-time policies, but you could start pushing inflation in the other direction. There was a report last year that said that raising some tariffs, including tariffs on U.S. allies, it could deliver a one-time reduction in consumer price index inflation of around 1.3 percentage points. Again, that's a one-time decrease, but yet that's 1.3 percentage points of inflation off the CPI. That is certainly not nothing. And yet President Biden keeps pushing in the opposite direction with more spending and policies like Buy America provisions that will make building the infrastructure and the roads that he wants to spend on more expensive in the first place. But Monet, what do you make of the prospects for the economy given the numbers that we're seeing now today? Again, after the recent good numbers, inflation figures, there had been some talk that maybe a soft landing is in the cards after all. And I wonder if there's rethinking of that as well. And I'd point today to a CNBC story. It's on a paper presented by some economists at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And they say we find no instance in which a central bank-induced disinflation occurred without a recession, unquote. And so, Monet, do you think that the economic worrying and hand-wringing is about to start all over again?
I'm not sure it ever quite stopped. I definitely do think that there were a lot of optimists who believed that a soft landing had become more possible because of the rate at which CPI had decreased over the past few months. But the smart money seems to have been betting on recession all along, and the PCE numbers from January probably will put a little bit more weight in that direction. I do think that people have been wondering over the past few months which was the more telling indicator, the fact that we had seen CPI decreases pretty steadily since the peak of inflation last summer, or the month-on-month hiring numbers that showed that the economy was still very hot. And I do think that the PCE numbers kind of help to mediate between those two indicators and suggest that the very robust hiring actually is telling the more accurate story and that the economy is still running hot. And so it does seem as if the clearest conclusion for the moment is that there are going to have to be several more months of interest rate increases, that the economy is going to have to be forcibly cooled in order to get inflation under control, and that a recession is still very likely. But of course, there are still mixed signals, and nobody knows for sure what the clearest outcome is going to be.
But if the economy starts looking like less of a sure thing, keep in mind we also have a political calendar running here. And the 2024 Republican primary is heating up. And Kate, it does strike me that President Biden had hoped that the inflation would be behind him by the time he was running for election in 2024. And I do wonder now whether some of the White House advisors and maybe President Biden himself are worrying if this is a monster that they're still going to be grappling with as we get into the 2024 election. Having inflation on your watch while you're sitting in the White House is a bad thing, but doing it while you're running for re-election is nobody's idea of a successful political background for your campaign. And Kate, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, Kyle, I mean, I think you're describing what we know is a very potent campaign theme, which is, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And so I do think if this persists, it will be a very potent theme for Republicans and they will try to pounce on it. That said, candidate quality and details do matter. And we saw inflation was raging hot during the midterms and should have been a clear winner for Republicans, and they underperformed. So it's not a sure thing. And I think Republicans have to put out a positive set of ideas on exactly how they plan to manage it.
Thank you, Kate and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.